Hello, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the World Government Summit COVID-19 and Government webinar series. Today's session is titled, Does COVID-19 mean a new global order? I take great pleasure in welcoming our moderator for today's session, Becky Anderson from the CNN.
Hello there.
Handing over to you.
Thank you very much indeed. And welcome to the latest in the World Government Summit's COVID-19 and Government series. It's an absolute honor to be anchoring this session today. Does COVID-19 mean a new global order? Well, this session is an opportunity to assess the response to countries around the world to a crisis that is still very much unfolding, and to discuss how those responses might provide some clues as to the possible direction of the global system in its wake. I am extremely delighted to be joined today by the Director General and CEO of the International Institute for Strategic Studies, Dr. John Chipman, who is today, as I understand it, in the United Kingdom, and by Frederick Kempe, who is President and CEO of the Atlantic Council. My panelists will share their views on where we are at, where we are going, and who wins and potentially who loses in a post-COVID world. Fred, let me start with you. You are in Washington, a city coping in recent days not just with a pandemic, but with pandemonium on its streets, protests and civil unrest related to the death of African-American George Floyd while in custody in Minneapolis with the police last week. Seeing the images on social media and on TV, Fred, you could be forgiven for thinking that the COVID crisis is over, but it is not, of course, not by any stretch. From your perspective, how do you rate the US response, both at home and on the global stage, and sketch out, if you will, some scenarios going forward?
Thank you very much, Becky. So first and foremost, America's global leadership has been based on values and has been based on effectiveness. And right now, I think the world is looking at the United States and yearning for that unifying leadership based on values and yearning for effectiveness. We've got the worst pandemic in a century, the worst economic downturn since the Great Depression of 1930, and now in the United States, the worst racial upheavals in 50 years. So this casts a pall over the next question you asked me, which is where could the global order go? For the last 75 years, we've lived under a post-World War II international order that was largely established by the US and its friends and allies, and most of the institutions, rules-based order that we have right now grew out of that period of time. I think there's a real question of how that survives the post-COVID period and how that survives. So let me outline three primary scenarios. Scenario work is very important in our business. It's not destiny. We're not predicting it's going that way, but it's looking out into the future and saying, well, there are these possibilities. And then you want leadership to help move things from the worst possible outcome to the best possible outcome. So let me go through the three scenarios that I would say ahead of this, but then leave another option to think about on top of that. The first scenario that we've talked about is a great accelerator downward. Some people call it descent into chaos. And that is that neither the US nor China really rises and emerges to lead for one reason or another. They both go through economic downturns through this. They're both unable to, and worse than that, they're really disagreeing and decoupling from each other. Europe isn't getting its act together either. You have divisions in Europe, and the transatlantic community isn't getting its act together. And the developing world gets hit even harder than everybody else. And so under this scenario, you have a world marked by deglobalization, increased poverty in the developing world, and the heightened risk even of armed conflict among the US, Russia, and China. The second scenario that we've looked at, and there are a lot of iterations within these scenarios. Let's not get into too much detail at this point. The second scenario is something we've called a China first scenario. And in this scenario, and you see that the Chinese leader, President Xi Jinping, is acting to try to use this scenario as the first country to emerge economically from COVID-19 and also from the pathogen. It expands its influence abroad while the United States struggles to revive its economy. So we will lose 7 or 8% this year in the United States. China could be 1% growth or more. United States and European allies fear a rising China, but they don't really coalesce against a rising China. And the America's allies in the Indo-Pacific region grow more economically dependent. China sees leadership as being the center of a global system, compared to the US sees leadership as being at the top of the global system. So this kind of leadership will look differently, but it really is a shifting of the global order from a US-led one to a Chinese-led one. The third, and this would be our preferred outcome, would be recovery and rejuvenation. And under this one, under this scenario, the United States recovers its appetite for global leadership, takes care of its internal issues in a better way, and works with its allies and other like-minded countries to lead a recovery and rejuvenation of our rules-based international order. They put forth a global response to the pandemic and facilitate economic resurgence. But this would depend on deep, sustained US and allied cooperation. And of course, it would benefit as well from cooperation with China. So this would not be done against China. Under the other category, you could list a bunch of different things, but let me just put two out very, very briefly. One of them, and one hears the UAE, one hears other countries talking about this, is a group of global countries see the US and China can't lead right now, but they want the global order to continue. And so they seize upon the public health issue. They build a global consensus around a group of countries that doesn't not include China and the US, but it's not led by China and the US. And at first, as another could be China last, that the authoritarian system in China proves too brittle, that they don't have the support of their people, that what they're doing in Hong Kong and elsewhere breaks down, that the world doesn't want to come with them. And so you actually have China not being able to rise to them. But let me leave it at that, because that gets then a little too complicated. I think the main issue are those first three, and then their different iterations.
No, absolutely. Thank you, Fred. John, let me bring you in at this point. Fred has sketched out a number of possible scenarios that the world is heading towards. What are your thoughts at this point, your perspective, if you will?
Well, I want to take you back to a year ago, when the International Institute for Strategic Studies did its strategic survey a year ago. We made the following conclusions. One, that the trends of 2018, 2019 all confirmed what we called the atomization of international society. Neither balance of power nor international rules-based governance served as ordering principles a year ago, pre-COVID, in the international system. International institutions had already become marginalized. National statecraft for small and bigger powers had come really to the fore. There was already less engagement through multilateral institutions as countries embarked on what we called a new process of strategic self-determination, where they had begun to renationalize their foreign policy, not so reliant on alliance structures that were becoming already destabilized. And the international system a year ago was already not working, because the country that had put most into it, the United States, was beginning to disinvest from it. A year ago, there was no predictable rhythm to international affairs. The disruptors were carrying most of the advantage, and those who were trying to cling to the status quo were already losing their grip. Some small powers were feeling really horribly squeezed by these pressures and the loss of certainty. Others were gaining sort of disproportionate bargaining power in the new diplomatic bidding wars. The so-called middle powers had not yet found a way to band together for long enough and on a sufficient variety of issues to make a difference. So I think that statecraft, vital interests, national resilience have for a year or two already been at the front and center of most governments' actions. And the COVID-19 crisis has accelerated these instincts. There will be occasional intergovernmental cooperation, but that's the most that I think can be expected in the short term. The desires for strategic autonomy in Europe, in North America, in the Middle East, in Asia, in Africa, in Latin America, are all going to be reinforced. They existed, these desires, before COVID-19. So for me, and I'll end my introductory remarks with this point, the likelihood in the short to medium term is that the world splits into a variety of different ecosystems with their own rules and customs and pretenders to regional leadership. Strategic self-determination was before an option. It will now be a necessity for the next year or two until some new balance is found. But for the moment, it's going to be 3 or 4 different ecosystems joggling for influence aside each other.
Fascinating. Okay, for those who are watching this today, welcome. You are more than welcome. We have a poll that will be running throughout this this session, and so let me just bring that up for you if I can, and we'd like you to get involved in this. Of the possible scenarios that the world is heading towards, which do you think is most likely? And I'm going to describe these in 4 ways. You've heard Fred lay out his scenarios. These are based on the sort of on the conceit of the arguments that Fred has laid out for you. So the first, the great accelerator downward. The second, will China be first? Global recovery and rejuvenation. And then, of course, Fred had laid out a number of other options. We will keep our poll today to these 3. So of the possible scenarios the world is heading towards, which do you think is most likely? Great accelerator downward, will China be first, or global recovery and rejuvenation? And we will come back to this poll as we move through this session. So I guess at this point, it's important then to start sort of breaking down where, Fred, you think we are at and what the evidence suggests today. You posed those possible scenarios. What currently do you believe the evidence suggests on the direction that we are going? Where are we going at this point?
Sadly, I think we're headed toward the descent into chaos, or some version of that. I do not think that. I think China would like to emerge as the global leader. I think the demographics of China, I think the nature of its government and the freedoms within China, I think the problems that they'll face in Hong Kong and what they've done in Hong Kong suggests to me that you might see a further move over a period of time with Taiwan. I don't think this is the kind of country that the world wants to be led by. And so as much as China might reach out, and I think right now they are making, there are 2 scenarios for Chinese power. One of them is regional led and one of them is global led. And I think they've shifted more to a global-led scenario where they gave $2 billion to the WHO. They're taking key positions at the head of multilateral institutions. So I think there'll be an effort at scenario number 2. I just don't think it's possible. And I think you're going to have more economic difficulties in China, and over time, probably more other difficulties. And the US at this point is not moving toward global leadership either. I think at the moment, because our leadership is based on values and effectiveness, we have to restore some, how can we drive an international order until we take care of our national disorder? So I think we have to address our political polarization. I think we have to address our social inequities that have been have dealt us this hand with the killing George Floyd and then the upheavals that have followed this. This is very serious stuff. And I don't think the president has unified the country, nor has he unified the international community. So we're unfortunately more likely to be in category 1. I don't think that China can pull off category 2, but you could have a version of that. And then, of course, what I hope for is that the US will regain its pace for global leadership at the same time that we understand we are a country that can correct our ills. We are a self-correcting, and history has shown we go through pretty dark periods now and again, but we self-correct. And so I'm hoping that will come about. And so right now, if I had to vote, I'd say 1. If I had to vote my preference and where I think the US returns to, I think we could get back to 3.
John.
Well, I think that none of the 3 prospective global leaders, the United States or potentially the European Union or China, will come out of this as an unopposed victor, as it were. I think in the case of the United States, even during the Obama administration, there were concerns that it was withdrawing from international affairs. And even if a new administration were to come into office in January 2021, as Fred says, there's a lot of the domestic political and economic house that has to be put into order before a more extrovert United States could undertake that enormous task of delivering a major public good like recreating a new international system. China has had, to borrow an economic phrase, a kind of V-shaped recovery. In January and February, it wasn't looking so good as it was struggling itself with COVID-19. And then because it was able to get itself out of at least the first phase and appear to get its workers back to work and hope for a % increase in GDP by the end of the year, it began to be looking good. But it has difficulties in its own region. Australia, has taken quite a tough attitude and been willing to deal with Chinese economic reprisals. It's irritated India that during this time, China has appeared to put some troops over the Chino-Indian border. Vietnam, that never really had that friendly a relationship with China. Interesting little factoid here: in January, Vietnam began cyber offensive operations against China in order to discover what the true facts were in Wuhan. And when they were seeing that the reports out of Wuhan were underreported in public, Vietnam began to take measures internally, which is why Vietnam has done quite well under the COVID-19 situation. So there's lots of suspicions in the neighborhood. I've always argued that China has talked about a multipolar world, but wants a unipolar Asia. They're probably going to get a unipolar Asia because Australia, Japan, and India haven't yet banded together enough to be able to contain China's desire for tributary status in the region. But it'll be hard for China with 1% GDP growth to really rule the world, as some would argue. And I would leave my thought about China with this sense, and that is that its big economic enterprise, the Belt and Road Initiative, is going to be under some stress if it's not growing at 6-7% a year, and it will suffer reputationally if, as is currently the case, it's the only G20 country that doesn't want to relieve African countries of debt. And in the meantime, the European Union is beset with all sorts of internal issues. And while the new president of the Commission, the great former defense minister Ursula von der Leyen, talks about a geopolitical commission, it hasn't yet really got a sense of what its strategy would be.
So let me just stop you there and add something, because just this week in a call with Angela Merkel, the Chinese president said that China stands ready to work with Germany and the EU to, and I quote him here, strengthen strategic cooperation, uphold multilateralism, tackle global challenges, and jointly add certainty to the current world of uncertainty. He said that China is ready to work with Germany to support, for example, the work of the World Health Organization to promote international cooperation within frameworks like the UN and the Group of 20, help African countries fight the coronavirus and contribute to the safeguarding of global public health security. You talked about the position with regard the EU, the sense that this is a bloc that really needs to come together at this point, and with some sort of concerted action, at least in the short term, to avoid a total economic and social breakdown. What do you make of China's outreach to the EU? How might that skew our scenarios going forward?
Well, as American political leaders like to say, I think Europeans will measure China by its actions, not necessarily by its words. The words that you cited of President Xi Jinping in his message to Angela Merkel would have been music to the European multilateralist ear. Every single thing that you quoted, every soundbite there could have come out of the European Union. The praise for multilateralism, the desire to do public goods, all of these issues will have been carefully crafted in order to appeal to a postmodern European sensibility. The difficulty is that China has also been playing divide and rule politics in the European Union. There's going to be an EU-China summit, but before that, China is trying to organize a summit of the so-called 17+1, a number of European EU countries that are signed up to the Belt and Road Initiative, much more amenable to Chinese influence. And you have within Europe an enormous division on that great technological Cold War of the day, which is moving towards what 5G system one will want to have. And Germany, which in the past had 50% of Huawei and Deutsche Telekom, is now having a very open debate as to whether they can absorb Huawei 5G into their own system. So as a practical matter, there will be, I think, a lot of competition between Europe and China, and the purely mercantilist approach that the EU traditionally took to China is not viable in the current circumstances. So I think China will have its diplomatic work ahead of it to win all of Europe over.
Becky,
Fred, please, yes.
Yeah, I think, as you know, I lived for 25 years working for the Wall Street Journal in Europe. And I agree with what John has said. I followed his work in IISS for a long time, and I've been stealing John's ideas. But I thought everything he said was right. Within that, let me say what I think the greatest strategic threat of our times is. If you like the last 75 years, which I think is a period of time, if you look at human history, of some of the greatest major power peace and then global progress. China's rise, India's rise, etc., has grown out of this period. And that's what's in danger. What was the basis of that? What was the anchor for that? Well, it was the US, European, the North American European, so Canada in there as well, relationship. There is not only a possibility, right now I would say a likelihood of strategic decoupling, which we have to avoid. And that, of course, is something that China would like to facilitate, not for the sake of decoupling, but because they want to be at the center, as John said, of a unipolar, more of a unipolar world. I also agree that the mercantilist Europe is disappearing. So this is more likely to divide Europe than bring Europe together. Europe needs a policy toward China. It needs an approach toward China. But it's really hard to achieve that when certain countries in Europe are becoming quite dependent on Chinese funding, Chinese trade, Chinese investments, while other countries are a little bit more wary of it. Where there's no doubt is what China is trying to do, and you see it through what they've done in multilateral. You've seen it in their National Party Congress, a huge investment in technology, and then a 6.57% increase in defense spending. So it sees this period of time, it sees the COVID, and President Xi has said this. He says that crises are a period of time where you can achieve major things in global change. And I think they see right now this period of time as a window of opportunity. And Becky, you reflected that in the conversation that President Xi had with Chancellor Merkel.
Can I just pause for 1 sec while we bring up our poll again? I'd like to bring this up at the end of this conversation as well, but I did think that this was useful. This is how our viewers and listeners have been responding to that poll of the possible scenarios the world is heading towards. Which do you think is most likely? 23% looking at great accelerator downward. Will China be first? 26% agreeing that is the most likely scenario going forward. And global recovery and rejuvenation. That's interesting. The majority just rather positive today. And in a world of a wretched world of negativity that we've been living in over the past sort of 8 weeks or so, I'm rather hopeful that our viewers and listeners here are feeling as optimistic as they are. Let's talk about global recovery and rejuvenation then. And John, we have a US election in 5 months. I was talking to somebody internally at CNN recently about what they expect from the campaign. They were suggesting that a campaign which, as we know in the US, would normally run for nigh on 2 years, would be more like a sort of a UK election campaign, 6 weeks in September and October. I think that may be slightly elongated now that we're seeing what we are seeing on the streets of US cities. But what of the potential for a new man on Pennsylvania Avenue, a new US president, and it will be a white man at this point? What chance that the US could lead from the front a global recovery and indeed rejuvenation? Do you share our listeners and viewers' optimism here?
Well, it might well be that the viewers' optimism derives from their own sense that in their own countries and their own region, their own leaders will be able to spur sufficient national and regional rejuvenation, that what happens in the United States or what happens in Europe is less consequential for them. And it's this spirit of strategic self-determination that I spy around the world coming to the fore again. People saying, well, maybe the United States won't be taking care of us, but we can begin to take care of ourselves. And certainly in the Gulf, all of the countries in that region have been uniquely aware of their vulnerabilities and dependencies for a while. And this sense of strategic resilience is perhaps finding a little bit of popular resonance. I don't think if you have a new American president in January 2021, it will inspire the immediate optimism that, for example, the original election of President Obama did, where the world felt they had their own president. It was even Le Monde, the French newspaper, praised Obama's election as if it were their own national leader that they were inviting to take global responsibilities. That uber optimism of the first few months of Obama's first term is not going to be the result of an election of Joe Biden. There will be a bit of a period of watching and waiting, and I imagine, as with every new American president that is elected, a rush to gain favor in Washington, numerous leaders trying to figure out what Joe Biden's priorities are and hoping that they could be amongst his priorities. But I do feel that, as we agreed earlier, there will be a year or two when the United States will have to put its domestic house in order now. I do agree with your CNN colleagues that because of the COVID-19 situation, you will see a very intense and contracted US electoral period. So a lot depends on what things look like, to use American political parlance, the day after Labor Day, because it'll be in those 6 weeks that the national mood will be most tested. If it were tested today, my question, perhaps one that Fred Kempe can answer, is does the fact that so many senior members of the US military, both current and former, both civilians in the DoD and uniformed in the DoD, appear now today and yesterday to be talking about their duty to defend the Constitution, mean that President Trump has lost a little bit of that faith from the military? And is that something that President Trump's base would be concerned about? Because normally President Trump's base would be pretty aligned with thinking of the women and men in American uniform. And what must be troubling Trump now is if he loses elements of that base because of the way people have criticized his invocation of special constitutional authorities, that will make for a very troubling electoral period, which actually will worry the world as much as any other result might.
Excellent question, Fred.
Becky, first of all, I just, I love the poll because I think what it underscores is a fundamental confidence that there's so much good in the future that we can steer toward that. If you look at progress in medicine, progress in technology, progress in education, we could go into one of the most enlightened periods of human history if we have the right leadership and if we have the right course. And the other thing about this optimism is it's optimists who can change the future for the better because they believe they can. And it's pessimists who are unlikely to change the future in a positive way because they feel they can't. So I love the people on this call, Becky, and thank you for the vote. I mean, you could say it's wishful thinking, but I think it's wishful thinking because we can actually together work toward that. What's happening in the United States this week, I think, is an inflection point. I write a weekly column called Inflection Points, but it is an inflection point. And we're a nonpartisan organization, so we don't take sides, Republican or Democrat, but we're not at all wishy-washy about our principles and our values. And I think what you're seeing this week is you're seeing the American people stand up for those principles and values, ranging from the Secretary of Defense, Mattis, President Trump's Secretary of Defense, calling out the president for being divisive, to the people on the street. President Obama yesterday gave a really short but very stirring statement. And he noticed that the people on the street with this racial upheavals were of all colors and of all ages and of all stripes. And during the period of Martin Luther King, let's not forget Martin Luther King talked about how in history, history bends toward freedom. I can't remember the exact quote, but that was it. And that was at a dark time where the laws were the laws were actually racist. We don't have laws in place that are racist any longer. We still have attitudes. We still have activities. The United States will emerge from this dark week and dark couple of weeks in a more just place because Americans, by and large, want it to move in that direction. That's what you're feeling. So I actually believe as terrible as the killing George Floyd was, and as awful as these upheavals are, and I don't think it gets better over the short term. I think it may be rougher over the short term and then better over the medium and longer term. But I do think you're seeing the beginning of an American renewal, partly because this abyss that we were headed toward is just a little bit too frightening for voters and for political leaders. So I share the optimism of the people who've been polled.
No, well, that's fantastic. Thank you for that. I wonder if we can and I just want to call out to our viewers and thank you for taking part in the poll. Do send your questions in, and we've been talking now for about 35 minutes. The session will go for 60 minutes. I'd love to get some questions from you guys for both John and Fred. This is a fantastic session. Do join in. It's your session and not ours, as it were. So do please send in your questions. We've got a chat box up here on the right-hand side of the screen, and I will put as many of those questions to our panelists as I can. I just want to move on from where we are at and these possible scenarios to what the rest of the world might make of what's going on, excuse me, and what the possible sort of opportunities there are out of this. Now, and I don't mean that to sound hideous in what is a terrible crisis. I mean, we're all going through this, and there's been a shocking loss of life. But as far as sort of foreign policy, as far as leaders around the world are concerned, where are those opportunities in a post-COVID world? I mean, we know that the United States risks a severe decline in soft power if it is seen to be struggling to manage the virus, or indeed failing to help its allies around the world? John?
Well, I would say that since COVID-19, as it were, exploded on the scene, there has not been a start of a new conflict, but there has not really been an end to any of the ones that have been ongoing. Of course, we have a peace arrangement of sorts in Afghanistan. There have been ceasefires in Yemen, but Russia is still engaged in Ukraine. Iran is still very active in the region through its influence networks. The type of geopolitical challenges that have been taking place now are not the kinds of geopolitical challenges where there was a clear invasion of a territory by a state army. So much is happening geopolitically as a result of information warfare, influence operations, what we in the profession call gray zone warfare, what others call hybrid warfare, which makes it a lot harder to build coalitions and alliances to defeat, a lot harder to know when a conflict has begun, when it's ended. So this undercurrent of instability, because of the nature of influence warfare, where various countries are stress testing the system, Russia and Europe, Iran and the Middle East, China in its own region with Hong Kong and Taiwan, this stress testing will continue, so there'll be some instability. On the other hand, and on the positive side, big geopolitical adventurism is a luxury asset. And we're now going into an economic recession and possibly an economic depression. So it has to be a very major, big national interest at stake for a country or a group of countries to arm itself into a major international adventure. And recent international adventures that have been undertaken have not been very productive, have cost more than was estimated, and have not brought too much geopolitical reward. So I think there'll be less adventurism of those of that kind, but there will still be this undercurrent as countries take advantage of the fact that there's no world policeman around, and there's not even perhaps much of a neighborhood watch scheme around either. That's what's happening now in East Asia, where because of a lack of a neighborhood watch scheme, China feels confident about imposing a new national security law on Hong Kong. And so there will be a need to revive those neighborhood watch schemes, at least, to ensure that people don't take undue advantage of the current uncertainties.
Number of questions now coming in. I'm just going to keep you with me, John, because I know that you talked about the Belt and Road Initiative slightly earlier on. A question from the UAE. How do you see COVID-19 affecting the Silk Road Reactivation Initiative by China? And a second question, this is from the CEO of Todak, Canada, US, and South Korea, on a different point, but I know it's different regions handling the issue of security and privacy of data. Do you have a judgment on which models may be better to follow and why?
Well, on the second point, clearly those countries where there has been no big popular dissent about surveillance technology or digital security have been able to deploy quickly all sorts of systems. But I noticed that in democratic countries, whether it's New Zealand or the United Kingdom, the debate about health security and privacy has been won on the side of health security. So I think the argument on privacy was already one that was becoming lost 2 or 3 years ago, when people were wondering why terrorists were able to exchange messages on WhatsApp without being intercepted. But 40 years ago, it was okay to open a letter between two people who were planning a criminal act. So I think already people were willing to empower their governments to engage in properly, judicially overseen, warranted invasion of privacy for very specific public goods, security and health being the two. I think on the Belt and Road Initiative, the first few years were an extraordinary explosion, as it were, of Chinese investment, so much so that in the West, people were wondering whether this was going to be a big debt for equity swap. But I think after that first 2 or 3 years, the Chinese themselves were becoming concerned that many of the countries to whom they were lending money were being overly indebted, that they weren't really going to be able to take the roads and ports they were building back home. And I think under the current circumstances, where the Chinese economy isn't growing at 6 or 7% a year, there will be some questioning being asked as to whether quite so much investment should be going abroad. I do think that in the end, the most significant elements of the Belt and Road Initiative won't be in the long term, uniquely geopolitically, the consequences of what ports or roads or railroads are built in Africa, Southeast Asia, Latin America, or even Europe. It will be the digital Silk Road. It will be about 5G. It will be about fiber optic cables. It will be about smart cities. It will be about e-commerce. And if China is able to drive the creation of a digital Silk Road, then it becomes a digital superpower. Because at present, China has access to the data of 1.4 billion people, but it's homogeneous data and therefore not so effective for the purposes of artificial intelligence and entrepreneurship and creation. If it gets the data of 3 or 4 billion people and it's heterogeneous data, that makes it a data superpower. And my own judgment, and it's an objective assessment, it's not, as it were, judgment on China, it's a judgment about China, that it perceives the challenge of becoming a digital superpower as being the most important, and therefore it'll be the digital Silk Road that will be the most vital to its international enterprise.
Fred. You'll need to unmute yourself.
I was trying to be polite so that people would not hear from next door, my daughter's schoolroom, with her expressing her strong feelings toward her teacher. That's the world we live in right now.
That's the world we live in today, correct.
Let me just say that on BRI, at the G20, there was this agreement to forgive debt. What we heard thereafter was the Chinese said, well, that doesn't include BRI debt. That doesn't include Silk Road debt. Well, that's the bulk of the debt that's owed toward China from developing countries. And so if they really wanted to do the world a favor right now in this COVID-19 period, they are in the position to do that. So everyone was really encouraged by the fact that China signed on to that debt forgiveness. But on the other hand, not really. And so I think China's feet should be held to the fire on that, because as a global leader, and if they want to be the global leader that they expressed they wanted to be to Chancellor Merkel, then Chancellor Merkel should be say to them, well, this would be a good place to start with debt forgiveness, because we're going into a difficult period for most of the countries that you are operating with the Belt and Road. On the data issue, I agree with what John has said. The only thing I would add to this is whoever has the technological commanding heights of a period tends to also have the geopolitical commanding heights of a period. It worries me worries me a lot, that there is a possibility that China could have the commanding heights of AI, quantum computing, 5G, with its attitude toward the creation and the sustaining of a surveillance state. So let's not forget, this isn't really China. It's the Communist Party, the Chinese Communist Party, and the Chinese Communist Party first and foremost wants to keep control, and domestic control, and then after that regional hegemony, and then after that, or alongside that, global influence. So I think we really have to work for standards and practices of technology for good. How can we ensure as a global community that data is to a certain extent protected, and also data can be used, it's not going to be perfect, but at least we could reach a set of parameters. On AI, I would say the same thing. And then quantum computing, of course, is the holy grail, and we have to watch that for sure. But I do think this whole new set of emerging technologies provides the world the promise of, you know, longer lives, better health care, you know, personalized health care, all sorts of benefits. But there's some real dangers in these technologies if they're used for nefarious purposes.
We've got a whole load of questions coming in, so I'm going to knock through some of these. A question from Slovenia, and thank you for this. How do we overcome cultural, religious, and societal differences regarding the use of technology? How do you educate people to embrace technology instead of being afraid of it, and considering the main human bias towards new things is fear? That's an excellent question, and I want you two to just consider your answers to that as I just go through a number of these other questions, because it's great that they are coming in and I don't want to ignore them in any way. We have a number of questions on China. Somebody from China asking the two guest speakers to what extent you think your views are influenced by your own political views and stance. Fair enough. China has used economic means to win over 130 countries, while the US has used military means to lose its popularity. Which means, in inverted commas, is better in a world that is more bothered about economic issues rather than political and military issues? Thank you for that question. And two more, because we've got about 10 minutes left. So I'm going to park these two with you as well. And this is a question, I can't see where it's from, but question, what will be the implications on peace while recovering from COVID? The UN has made a call to halt armed conflict. Have conflict-ridden countries responded positively to this request, or perhaps those attacking conflict-ridden countries should have been the question, but there you go. That one, and the last one here, which I think would be a useful one for us to end on. What are the main opportunities the panelists see in the next decade? John.
Well, on technology, I think the younger generation are generally rather quick and happy adopters of technology, and I'm sure in Slovenia that's the case, and no one needs much to be inspired to adopt technology. I think the challenge lies more in governments that tend to be populated by people of an older generation, wondering how they regulate the new technologies and how they balance the interests of the private sector and public goods. And I think we haven't arrived at that balance yet. Look at the debates about Twitter and Facebook and whether these are publishing platforms or other form of media. So I think defining what the purposes are of different technologies and how they're to be regulated is still an enormous challenge. I think from the IISS perspective, we try to look objectively at all countries in the world, including China. And China's, of course, done an amazing job bringing several hundred million people out of poverty. That in and of itself has been enormous global public good. The difficulty is that now you have in China, unfortunately, a lot of diplomats posted around the world who, over-interpreting perhaps their head of state's instructions, are trying to bully people into believing the Chinese narrative on all issues. And 20 or 30 years ago, people might have gotten tired of some American diplomats doing that. It's a natural consequence of a country's rise that their diplomats abroad will try to inspire people to understand their national narrative. And so people in China will need to get used to the fact, as Americans did for several generations, that people will always be criticizing them. That's part of acquiring great power status. The third question, and I'll end with this because we'll want to give time later to opportunities on conflict and the opportunities. I think one of the unfortunate cynicisms in conflict today is that so much of it, so much of the internal conflicts, especially in Africa, are managed by non-state actors who take such a cynical view towards things like humanitarian assistance. And at a time of a pandemic, it is the delivery of humanitarian assistance that is most vital And that delivery is still being frustrated by aggressive non-state actors that are using the COVID-19 pandemic in order to advance their narrow and often sectarian aims. So one area where there should be a real global consensus and where countries of all political stripes should be able to unite is to be able to argue in favor at this time and at this moment for the delivery of humanitarian assistance to wherever it might be needed, and especially in those so horribly overpopulated refugee camps in the world where COVID-19 can spread at such pace. So that's what a principle around which the world should unite, and I'm sure the people of China, to go back to that questioner's point, can support as well.
Fred, why would China go to the trouble of upsetting the global order when it can simply take it over? That is a question, perhaps more of a statement than a question from the UAE. Pick up off the back of what John has been discussing, if you will.
Yeah, I like that last question you came to me. I think that is the Chinese view. There's a 1960s comic strip in the United States called Pogo. And Pogo famously in that comic strip said, "We have met the enemy and he is us." And that's where the United States is right now. Our enemy isn't China. Our enemy is ourselves at the moment. We have to rebuild our economy. We have to expand our infrastructure. We have to improve our education in science and mathematics and everything else. We have to regain the confidence in what we've been standing for 75, 80 years. We're one of the few countries in the world that was founded through a revolutionary war, through the Declaration of Independence, Constitution, right up to Lincoln's Gettysburg Address on principles, on values. And so we have to show the world, first and foremost, we have to be true to our values, our principles, and be effective and be a magnet for people. Regarding China, I don't want to be misunderstood in this conversation. We have to do two things at the same time for the world's sake. We're going to be competitive, and we're getting more sharply competitive than ever before. And the rhetoric's really heated up, and I don't think it's going to get better before the November election. I think between US and China could get worse. We have to get to a point where we can be competitive and fiercely competitive, but also collaborative, taking on the issues that you have to take on, whether it's climate, whether it's avoidance of war, the humanitarian issues that John is talking about. On the military question, because I think I do need to answer that, I think the UN has put military first in some cases where we forget that the reason that we won the Cold War, and we did win the Cold War, and there was a collapse of the Soviet Union and of communism and a spread of democracy throughout Europe. And also, I think China greatly benefited from that spread of globalization, et cetera. And we see that, of course. We can't forget that, yes, we had a military deterrent, and that stopped the worst from happening, but we never used it. And that we really shifted the battlefield, if you will, was the attractiveness of the United States and its allies and friends as an economy. People wanted to become part of the larger, freer, more prosperous Europe. People wanted to become part of the quote-unquote West. So I didn't want to go on too long on that, but I think it's really important to say that we really have to look after our own house and put our own house in order, first and foremost, if we want to be global leaders again. But I don't think we have the benefit of waiting to do the one to perform the other. So we have to engage in international collaboration, even as we fix our own ills. And then I'll just very quickly answer the technological fear issue. We just have to demystify these new technologies. And I think that's really up to leaders and understand the technologies and talk together about how we can use them collaboratively across the world, because I think there are some things to fear from these new technologies, and that's why there has to be a global conversation of the sort that we're not really having about how these technologies ought to be used and how they ought not to be used.
We have about 2 minutes, and I'm going to run over just a little bit because this has been absolutely fascinating. I want to bring the poll back up and then get a sense from those who have joined us today how they feel about the global system post-COVID 19, and then give you both just 90 seconds to provide a closing argument, if you will. So let's just bring the poll up, if we can, of the possible scenarios the world is heading towards. We've been discussing today which we think is most likely. Great accelerated downward. Will China be first? Or global recovery and rejuvenation? We looked at this poll about halfway through our session today, and the response was quite an optimistic one. Global recovery and rejuvenation was certainly winning the day at that point. I haven't got the poll up. Here we go. First poll results were 23% one, 26% two, and 51% three. And as I understand it, unless I can see something different, the poll remains as it was halfway through. So that's fascinating. The majority of those listening and watching with us today looking for a more positive outcome post COVID-19. Fred, you've got the talking stick on my laptop here, so why don't you just provide us, if you will, with your closing thought before I pass the talking stick to John.
I think the main thing to recognize at this period of time is, we have seen in previous pandemics that major things change on the stage through pandemics, and all the way back to the Peloponnesian Wars, and so what you have to do at this period of time is understand that things will not be the same in a post-COVID world as they were before. At the moment, we're not unifying in the way we should be. We're not seizing the moment to create a better world, but we're in the front end of this. This is not, we're not even at halftime, in my view. We've got a long way to go. And so I think there's still a lot of time for the world to get its act together to deliver on that vision number 3. So I would just urge everyone who has a role within their companies, within their ministries, within their countries, to understand that this is one of those plastic moments where you can shape the future and where history can actually accelerate. So I would plead with those who want to make it accelerate in a positive direction to step in right now and do what they can.
Thank you for that. And John?
Well, I'll stick with my theme of strategic self-determination. And given that this is the World Government Summit, I will conclude with 6 questions. And this, I think, is the challenge for governments as they exercise their strategic self-determination. 1, how do you build resilience and redundancy, and in what key sectors? 2, how do you choose between efficiency, which requires limited cost, and effectiveness, which requires surplus capacity? 3rd, how do you balance government and individual responsibility in the post-COVID age? 4th, how do you ensure that nationals are in charge of critical infrastructure when global supply chains are uncertain, while still being able to attract international talent? 5th, how do you provide a fiscal stimulus when public spending has to go down? And 6th and finally, how do you encourage young entrepreneurship and create exportable industry? If government leaders find positive answers to those 6 questions, then the optimism for which our audience voted for will, I think, be realized.
And let's just bring up that poll finally and show what our viewers and listeners have, or what they're telling us. Great accelerated downward, 17%. Will China be first, 18%. Our audience continues to feel a ripple of optimism in what have been these wretched days. This has been a fantastic conversation. 65% of our viewers and listeners looking for a global recovery and rejuvenation. I thank you both very much indeed for joining us. This has been absolutely fascinating. And thank you for those of you who have been attending this session. You know that the registration links for our webinars next week will be published at the URL on the chat box on your right-hand side. And that is it from me. That just leaves me to hand back over to Reem, who will say goodbye. Thank you, Reem.
Thank you, Becky. Thank you, Dr. John. Thank you, Frederick. This has been really an insightful session. I think the polls are a true representation of our audience, our global community, and the people who are going to shape this new global order together in a world filled with optimism and definitely global recovery. So I think we all leave today looking forward to what the new global order is going to be, but on a positive note. And I think that's very healthy, and we're all going to work together for that. And thank you so much. And thank you for the audience for all the amazing participation, and stay tuned for our sessions, which are also posted on our website. Thank you so much. Take care, everyone, and stay safe.
Thank you.
Thank you, Reem. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.